Welcome back to the tally room here in Canberra for what should be the last federal election this century.
On the 3rd of October 1998, Australians went to the polls.
In Sydney, the Prime Minister has been watching from his official residence early on.
John Howard had taken the biggest gamble of his political career. He'd risked his prime ministership on a long-held economic vision, the GST.
What's the mood?
Well, at the moment, there is a good deal of anxiety.
At various points, I was convinced we were going to lose that election. We were bringing forward tax reform and asking the people to vote us in to change the tax system. Big call.
We're showing a 2% swing to Labor, too close to call.
As the first results came in, the mood at Kirribilli House was tense. The government's future was on the line.
That night was certainly a roller coaster ride.
We're seeing a very substantial swing to the Labor Party, something like 9.7%.
But then, after about an hour and a half's counting, things turned around.
It now appears that the government will hang on.
By then, I reached for a drink.
I tell you what, the government's going to have a lot of marginal seats after this election.
Another drink, I might say.
For John Howard, this was a victory to savour. For much of his first term, he'd battled to establish his legitimacy as a leader. Now, despite winning less than 50% of the popular vote, he had a mandate for tax reform.
There'd be enough demand to sustain.
As he sped across town, he was still composing a speech that would set the tone for his government's next term.
On election nights, the Prime Minister, he has a little quiet period on his own. And early in the night, staff or people like me might say, oh, you probably ought to just remind people this when you're up on the stage, with your hands in the air. But in the end, you're never quite sure what he's going to say.
By the time John Howard moved to address the party faithful, he knew precisely what he would say. And it would surprise many.
And I also want to commit myself very genuinely to the cause of true reconciliation with the Aboriginal people of Australia by the centenary of Federation.
If I'd have given you odds on what policy he would commit himself to at the end of a 12-month GST campaign, I'd have given you 100 to 1, it would have been Aboriginal reconciliation.
More shocks were on the way. Knowing full well that Peter Costello had devised the GST, John Howard then quite pointedly heaped praise on the Treasurer's fiercest political rival, Jeff Kennett.
And could I also particularly thank the Premier of Victoria, Jeff Kennett. Jeff has been a forthright supporter of the cause of taxation reform, and I acknowledge the contribution that he made during my election campaign.
Look, on the election night, John Howard thanked me. I think he also thanked Jeff Kennett.
Jeff Kennett was thrown in as being very pivotal to tax reform, and obviously he hadn't worked for a day on the package, so all that was very obvious to him. He noticed it, and yeah, he was hurt by it. Absolutely.
Certainly I didn't intend and never have intended any slight.
This would not be the last surprise from John Howard. In the coming 3 years, he would take the country to the brink of war, fracture his relationship with Peter Costello, and use the Defence Force to create what would become known as the Pacific Solution. But that was all in the future. November 1998. John Howard was back in Canberra and back in power. He had just one priority:
When it comes to tax reform, the Prime Minister's enthusiasm for his GST knows no bounds.
The government will move quickly to put its bold new plan in place.
There was one problem. The government needed support in the Senate to make the GST law. To get that, the Prime Minister turned to the man who'd helped create the tax, Peter Costello. The Treasurer's task? To woo the Tasmanian Independent Senator, Brian Harradine.
And I kept on talking to him. Brian, are you happy? Is there anything you're worried about, Brian? Are there any areas that are of concern to you? I went to him on the budget night. And I said, how do you like the budget, Brian? Have you got any complaints? No complaints.
And the question is whether I'm going to be a party to imposing an impersonal, indiscriminate tax on my children, my grandchildren, and their children for generations to come. I cannot.
Well, my world started crashing around me, swimming. And the thing is, it wasn't that he had an unmet demand in the end. He had an in-principle objection.
I felt better.
So all of this whining and dining and duchessing was done for naught.
The question then became, well, what do we do now?
Pretty quickly it was clear that, you know, there was one other avenue, and that was the Australian Democrats.
There was no alternative. And if we had abandoned the whole thing, that would have crippled the authority of the government and certainly my authority as Prime Minister, and it would have been damaging to the Treasurer.
No, absolutely, that's never been done.
With the stakes high and getting higher, the Prime Minister once again left negotiations to his Treasurer, this time with the Democrats' leader, Meg Lees.
You've got views based on prior experience, haven't you, of Peter Costello's negotiating skills?
Oh, absolutely. I think he needs to go and get himself a dictionary and look up the word negotiation.
Meg, of course, was trying to get exemptions. I, of course, was trying to stop exemptions.
I got a very clear indication from him that he felt it was his GST, almost in a personal sense, not so much even it's the government's GST, it's mine, and you really don't have any right to touch it.
The GST I had designed was hard to sell in a policy sense, but easy to implement in a practical sense.
Well, Peter was getting more and more despondent about the way the negotiations were going. It was clear the Democrats were not going to budge. They were insistent that food should be removed from the package.
He made it quite clear he wasn't going anywhere on food. And I said, well, if that's where we're at, there is no point in going on, and we left. And I remember going back to the Democrat offices and saying to other staff, look, we'd better start preparing material to say that we're also saying no, as Mr Harradine did.
But John Howard hadn't played his full hand. After a 20-year crusade, his latest push for tax reform was not going to end here.
I was determined to get an outcome. I was not going to allow this huge reform to go down the drain simply because we couldn't get 100%.
When negotiations started again, the Prime Minister was in the driver's seat. He began the process by giving the Democrats the full 5-star treatment.
We invited the leadership of the Democrats into the cabinet room in Melbourne. I mean, you don't do that to everybody. It's a certain symbol, and I wanted them to understand from the very beginning that I was going to try very hard to get an outcome.
That first meeting with the Prime Minister, he put aside all those issues that were contentious and basically looked at, well, what can we agree on? How can we work?
The talks proved more taxing than anyone had anticipated. after a full week of negotiation, food remained the major stumbling block.
I really do need to go back and talk to my colleagues, and the news isn't all good.
If we moved to a situation which was easier in a policy sense, no GST on food, the practical implementation was going to be a nightmare. And I knew that would come back to bite us.
The negotiations were difficult, but they weren't acrimonious. I mean, I was determined that they weren't going to break down. Absolutely determined.
I knew he was worried about the food. And I said, listen, John, don't worry about it. Taking food out, it's not the big issue, mate. And I said, look, John, what do you want to be? The bloke who introduced the world's second best GST after the New Zealanders? Or do you want the bloke who promised that you'd do it and didn't do it because you wanted to tax poor people's food? I mean, for heaven's sakes, it's just not an issue. Don't worry about it.
By the 27th of May 1999, an agreement was agonisingly close. And the government's determination to close the deal was clearly on show.
I remember late that night, our researcher, Susan Brown, wanting some chamomile tea. A great search was on through the cabinet area for some herbal tea so that Susan could keep working.
And people scratching their heads because there wasn't much herbal tea around the PM's office at the time, I don't think, and people were dispatched around the building, including Maximore Wilton, to try and find some herbal tea. I don't know where they found it in the end, but I think it proved to be a very nice cup of tea.
It said they were prepared to do anything. In other words, we'd got so close. We'd got so much of the package together by that last night. Item by item, we'd ticked them off. And eventually, left with food, the Prime Minister agreed. And at some stage, we then shook hands, and finally, it was all over.
Oh, I was elated when we finally got the agreement. I really was, and I felt that we had achieved not everything that we'd set out to, but we had, against the odds, achieved an outcome.
You must be happy.
What's that, the favourable outcome for the government?
Good outcome. Good outcome all round, good for Australia.
In public, at least, Peter Costello was accentuating the positives.
Good outcome. Thanks for coming. Good to see you.
In private, he was less impressed. His dream GST had been watered down, and the whole tax negotiation had thrown the spotlight on the very different styles of the Treasurer and the Prime Minister.
Howard and Costello are a bit like a couple of fiddlers. They've got their Stradivarius and they've got their tune, and part of the tune is the good cop tune and part of it's the bad cop tune.
In all of the meetings, we were negotiating jointly. I mean, it's quite right. I think Howard played good cop, I played bad cop. I have no doubt, by the way, if we hadn't done it that way, the outcome would have been less optimal.
Well, that suggests that it was a teamwork situation. You know, I'll be the bad cop, you be the good cop, and we'll see if we can fix it between us. I don't think it was that, actually.
Well, that's very good. I like that.
Well, John Howard just ran it, full stop.
I think I put it fairly and tactfully in this fashion that it was absolutely crucial to those negotiations with the Democrats that I was there all the time.
However tactfully John Howard might put it, the GST deal had massively enhanced his authority. He had succeeded where his predecessors, both Labor and Liberal, had failed. But John Howard was about to embark on a crucial period of his prime ministership that would take him well beyond his comfort zone.
John Howard felt more comfortable at home and dealing with domestic issues than he did international issues in his early days, and that's only natural, because he knew home.
Howard, I think, had perfect pitch for domestic politics. He could judge exactly how a domestic political audience would hear what he was saying. He had a complete tin ear for the way foreigners heard what he was saying.
When it comes to foreign policy in the region, Indonesia is Australia's big-ticket item. For decades, Australia's relationship with its near neighbour had been viewed through the prism of East Timor and its brutal occupation by Indonesia.
While Indonesia was trying to recover from its economic crisis and trying to reform its political system, the East Timor issue became like a sore thumb, which always attracted international attention towards Indonesia.
The fall of President Suharto and the rise of B.J. Habibie had the potential to change the dynamic between the two nations. East Timor would be the testing ground.
My attitude was, from the first day, is that I took over to solve that and not to give that as a problem to my successor, whoever it will be. No. Solve.
His solution, autonomy within the Indonesian Republic.
I'm ready to consider, as the president, to give East Timor a special status.
In the summer of 1998, John Howard made a fateful decision. Working with his Foreign Affairs Minister, Alexander Downer, he wrote a letter to President Habibie, setting out a change in Australia's position towards East Timor.
Well, the reason we decided to launch this change of Australian policy was that we felt that increasingly the current arrangements were untenable.
It hijacked our relationship with our largest neighbour, Indonesia, and a good relationship between Australia and Indonesia is kind of handy in Australian diplomacy.
The letter they wrote supported the idea of autonomy, but went much further, suggesting a compromise political solution where the East Timorese would have the chance to vote on independence within a decade.
I turned around to Alexander Downer and put my hand on his shoulder and said, "Mate,
this is big. This really is very big."
We both felt that it was a huge change in Australian policy.
It was a significant policy step. Australia was moving from a position in which we had not supported any act of self-determination in East Timor to one in which we supported the idea of an act of self-determination a decade or more in the future.
But John Howard's biggest foreign policy initiative was divulged to only a select and privileged few.
Let me tell you something. The most important letter ever written during the coalition government's period of office, leading to the creation of East Timor, never went to Cabinet.
Yeah, well, when we heard that the letter had been sent, I think we were a bit amazed.
But I mean, look, with a lot of these foreign affairs things, I'll be honest with you, I'll tell you something that I wouldn't necessarily have said when we were in government. I mean, basically, John Howard and I worked together. We didn't necessarily draw everybody in, everyone else in at every stage of these kinds of decisions.
The authors of the letter thought they'd delivered a diplomatic masterstroke. But President Habibie saw it differently.
In this letter, he suggests that I have to solve East Timor as how the French has solved their colonies in the Pacific, New Caledonia. You know, he suggested. That means prepare them for 10 years or whatever, and then after that give them their independence. So, as I read that, I was upset. It is John Howard who make me make a quick decision.
John Howard's plan had backfired. President Habibie made a snap decision. East Timor would have a UN-supervised referendum on independence within 6 months.
It wasn't the intention of anyone to start a process which would lead to
to independence quickly.
It is true that none of us had envisaged that that's what Dr. Habibie would have done. Dr. Habibie went further, but the direction in which he travelled was the same direction that was requested in the letter. It's just that he went much further. He went 20 miles instead of 5.
In the weeks that followed, John Howard learnt a harsh lesson in foreign affairs. Actions have consequences, and in this case, they were lethal. News of the ballot provoked a violent reaction in East Timor from militia groups loyal to Jakarta. With thousands of troops on the island, it was a situation the Indonesian Army, or TNI, could have easily controlled. It did not.
We had very clear evidence of active TNI engagement in militia violence. What portions of the TNI system, how far back up the chain of command to Jakarta that went, and who in Jakarta was involved was much less clear.
Hello there, how are you?
John Howard was appalled at the violence, and at a summit in Bali, he told President Habibie the only solution was to allow a UN peacekeeping force to take control.
I raised with him as strongly as I could the notion of having peacekeepers inserted into East Timor before the vote. And he said to me, John, I can't do that from a domestic political point of view. That is unsustainable.
It is just like putting petrol into a fire. Because I would insult the whole TNI as that they were not able to control the stability in East Timor. I cannot.
By that stage, we knew what was at stake. We knew how risky it was going to be for TNI to be left in control of security in the lead-up. Our diplomacy was simply not energetic enough.
We could have said Australia's having nothing more to do with this and the whole UN operation there would have collapsed and the ballot wouldn't have taken place. We could have done that. I made the judgment that that would be entirely the wrong thing to do, that we should proceed with the ballot because this was a once-in-a-generation opportunity to solve the East Timor problem.
If this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for democracy, it was also a situation with the potential for catastrophe. On the 30th of August 1999, the East Timorese voted overwhelmingly in favour of independence. But within days, everyone's worst fears were realised. With Indonesian forces looking on, the militia went on a rampage, killing hundreds and setting the island ablaze. The consequences of the failure to persuade Indonesia to accept a peacekeeping force were clear for all to see.
Well, the reaction in Australia got increasingly alarmed as the result of the ballot was known and the violence and the apprehended violence increased. People got more and more concerned and more demanding that we do something.
We're doing absolutely nothing. Now, show some backbone as a leader of this nation.
This idea that willy-nilly Australia should enter into commitments involving the potential use of Australian forces you're getting into very dangerous territory.
It was an extraordinary period. The reaction right across the electorate was you've got to do something. And even when you said, look, do you really want to invade our nearest neighbour? They'd say yes. Do it.
The imperative there politically was to do something.
Domestically and internationally, John Howard's reputation was now on the line. He had to persuade Indonesia to allow a peacekeeping force into East Timor or witness a disaster of monumental proportions take place right on Australia's doorstep.
John Howard devoted basically the whole day and a good part of every evening till he went to sleep for 2 or 3 days, maybe more, putting this together, talking with President Clinton, leaders around the world, and Kofi Annan.
I knew that he was going to raise the possibility of an interfet force, a United Nations sanctioned force. And I was in a position to tell him that Australia would make a very significant contribution to that. I did make it very clear from the beginning that Australia expected to lead it.
And what made those first days of September so challenging for us was to come to terms with the fact that we were going to do something that we hadn't previously believed we could do.
In fact, it rapidly became clear that Australia could only successfully lead a peacekeeping mission with the backing of the United States.
Hello?
But President Bill Clinton was proving hard to convince.
I said to him, no, we've always been there to help in scraps in which you've been involved, and I think we could do with some American troops and as much help as you can give us. And he said, well, John, I understand that, but it's going to be very hard for me to provide any ground troops.
Hello?
John Howard wouldn't take no for an answer.
Hello.
Now we're here.
Now we're here.
In Auckland for an APEC meeting, he put his view to the President in person.
Thank you, fellas. Once he understood the strength of my feeling and the concern I had, I thought Bill Clinton reacted very well on that issue.
When the Prime Minister had in fact convinced the President then said, well, what do you actually need?
We wanted airlift, we wanted logistics, we wanted some very specialised kinds of intelligence support, and we wanted a kind of an over-the-horizon deterrence presence from the United States. They gave us all of those.
But Australia also needed America's diplomatic muscle, and Bill Clinton delivered.
I have made clear that my willingness to support future economic assistance from the international community will depend upon how Indonesia handles the situation from today forward.
A couple of minutes ago, I called the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Kofi Annan, to inform him about our readiness to accept international peacekeeping forces through the United Nations from friendly nation to restore peace and security in East Timor.
Yay, we had got it. President Habibie had agreed to the peacekeeping force.
The time for celebration was still some way off. A dangerous road lay ahead. Australian-led UN troops would confront renegade militias and their political masters, the Indonesian army.
Could war have resulted with Indonesia? Well, certainly it could have. I mean, these were uncertain grounds, uncertain areas for us.
And I had at the back of my mind they might have an encounter with the Indonesians. There might be a firefight right at the beginning. You could lose 20 or 30 troops in a clash. And it was tough.
Accepting that war with Indonesia was now a real possibility, the order was given for key tactical Air Force units to be repositioned.
We deployed to Northern Australia, to Tyndall and elsewhere, some frontline combat aircraft, F-18s and F-111s. We expected Indonesia, we hoped that Indonesia would have seen those deployments. We certainly didn't announce them, but they were intended to send our own warning to Indonesia and to TNI that if they chose to escalate, then we would be in a position to escalate too.
We had American forces that could have been deployed pretty quickly as well from the Pacific. So we did have contingency plans.
As our forces approached Dili, an Indonesian submarine was detected in the vicinity of Dili Harbour, and we didn't know who had ordered it to be there, what it was doing there, but we did know that a submarine has the capacity to sink ships pretty fast. It was quite a threat to our operations. Now, in the end, we took a cautious approach to that. We decided not to prosecute contact with the submarine as aggressively as we might have in other circumstances. That was a fairly risky decision in itself, but in the end, justified.
On the 20th of September 1999, John Howard's hand-picked general, Peter Cosgrove, led the first contingent of Interfet troops into Dili. The deployment went like clockwork, and at home, the Prime Minister breathed a sigh of relief.
I sweated on the first news, as you always do after they had arrived in East Timor, and then the first news came through. It was quite good, and then further news came through, and after a while we all started to relax.
Thanks very much.
John Howard had taken his country to the point of war and survived. East Timor had independence. There'd been a heavy cost, but at home there would be a long-term political dividend.
He showed competence, he showed action, he showed the ability to negotiate with international figures in a way that they hadn't seen before, and they basically saw that and went, well, that's pretty good. Geez, he's good at this.
Before East Timor, before 1999, nobody thought of John Howard as a national security leader, including John Howard himself. So I think it reframed his view of himself and Australians' view of himself fundamentally.
John Howard was now a player in international circles. But his promise on election night of reconciliation with Indigenous Australians remained unfulfilled.
I think reconciliation was just an issue that dogged us throughout the whole government.
For many, reconciliation needed to start with the word sorry.
And then we go on in this resolution to express deep and sincere regret that Indigenous Australians suffered injustices under the practices of past generations.
I don't know why we didn't apologise. It was an instinctive thing to do.
Hello, how are you? How are you? Great to see you. I had a very strong view about the formal apology. How are you? I was always against it, and I retain that view because I don't think the current generation can accept responsibility for the deeds of earlier generations.
So we were bogged down in this linguistic argument, you know. You could be sorry for something, but you don't say sorry for it. And really, what people were hearing when they heard all that was, you're not willing to reach out, you're not willing to cross the divide.
In May 2000, these tensions between the Prime Minister and his Treasurer came to a head over the walk across Sydney Harbour Bridge.
The Cabinet met and had a discussion, what should we do? I wanted to walk. There were others in the Cabinet who didn't want to walk.
Our view politically was that it could look a bit ragged if you have some ministers walking and others not walking.
There was a tearing of loyalties when the discussion took place. You wanted to be loyal to your Prime Minister, you didn't want to and would never want to embarrass him. On the other hand, your conscience maybe told you that we should go through this process.
I indicated that I wasn't going to march, and I said that if you had a situation where everybody else marched or all the senior people marched, that would create a perception of division inside the government.
And I said, well, if that's your view, let's all walk. Let's all go together. I said, if you want a knockout demonstration, imagine the whole Cabinet walking across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I said, that'll send a message. But John Howard didn't want to walk.
Well, he was seen, I think, within the Cabinet as wanting to differentiate himself from John. And no one in the Cabinet would agree with that. Why would they? I mean, why would you give licence to one of your own to somehow sort of put themselves in a sort of better position than the PM, you know, publicly, in a sort of public display?
Imagine 17 people walking across the Sydney Harbour Bridge saying, yes, we're for reconciliation. I actually think it would have lifted the hopes and aspirations of so many people. I argued for that in the Cabinet. John Howard didn't agree with me. A majority of the Cabinet didn't agree with me. But I couldn't really just do it myself. It would have been played back into the whole leadership issue.
If there were tensions inside the cabinet room between John Howard and his treasurer, in public they weren't on show. Then, on his 61st birthday, the Prime Minister did what should have been a routine radio interview. What followed was an exchange he and his staff would long regret.
You're on 702.
We'd got a birthday cake because it was his birthday as well, and we were all waiting for him to come back to cut the cake. And then we heard this on the radio.
If the party wants me to lead it to another election, which will be at the end of next year, I'm happy to do so.
It was one of those sort of laid-back interviews, hugely dangerous.
After that, obviously, one has to recognise I'll then be in my 63rd or 4th year, and you start to ask yourself, and that's fair enough, and nothing is forever.
I'm thinking, why on earth did he say that?
And I don't have the view that I am so indispensable and so important and so vital that you know, the Liberal Party will be bereft without me.
I privately thought to myself, well, we'll see about that.
You know, the worst thing in politics is a surprise for anyone, political operatives or politicians, and that was a surprise.
Created a drama that the government didn't really need. So I told him I didn't think it had been such a good idea.
Alexander, he absolutely got stuck into John over that. He said, you know, it was the worst thing you've ever said. You shouldn't have said it. You've got to retract it tomorrow. You know, Alexander was very unhappy about it. He was very good, Alexander. He could always really give John a complete bucket if he felt like it. John was good enough to take it.
By raising the possibility of retirement after the next election, John Howard seemed to be giving Peter Costello's leadership aspirations a lift.
Thank you.
At least that's the way some saw it.
John Howard didn't have many slip-ups on radio. I thought it was a very deliberate thing to say. I didn't think at the time that he dropped his guard or didn't mean anything by it.
Do you know what his intentions are?
Well, that is a matter for Mr. Howard, and I thought he explained it all on radio this morning, and I have nothing to add. This was a public statement, unasked for, unprompted, undemanded, which I understood meant that he was going to consider his position with a view to passing on to a successor in July of 2003. That's the only way I think you could interpret it. That's what most people did.
Well, people say I was sending a message. Well, I wasn't sending a message, and if somebody thought I was sending a message, they should have asked me if I was sending a message. I wasn't sending a message.
The "when I'm 64" comment, you know, became the elephant in the room from then on, really.
Thank you.
Whatever might happen in the future, for now the mood inside the government was buoyant.
Well done.
John Howard had every reason to believe he could win the next election and, if he chose, hand on the leadership.
Thank you.
The voters, though, had other ideas.
We'd ended the year 2000 in a very strong position, but it seemed to go sour over the Christmas-New Year period.
We'd had a very rapid rise in oil prices. We'd had the introduction of the GST, and the Australian economy had slowed down significantly in the last quarter, I think, of 2000.
At the same time, petrol prices were rising, and it was a very convenient thing to blame the GST for rising petrol prices.
Mr Costello, there's a lot of disaffection out there
There
at the moment,
does
isn't
appear to
there?
be some disaffection in the broader community.
And have you identified where that disaffection is?
Yes, we do a great amount of polling. We know very well what's going on out there. The disaffection appears to be centred currently in the country, in the cities and in the regional centres.
Everywhere?
It does seem fairly general just at the moment, yes.
It's 25 past 8 here in the west.
There were devastating losses in state elections in WA and Queensland, and it seemed the federal government might be next.
We were genuinely flabbergasted, and I am to this day, at the level of collapse in support for us. We seem to be right back in the darkest days of 1998.
Okay,
Some might have been rattled, John Howard was not. Long considered an ideologue, the Prime Minister was about to alter the government's approach and stamp his authority on his cabinet once and for all.
And I remember I called the leadership group to the lodge and I went through my concerns and I said we're in deep trouble and we need a dramatic cut through and an acknowledgement to the public that we've heard them and we're going to do something about it.
I came up with two proposals. One was to cut excise and the other was to abolish indexation. And I wanted the government to have one or the other. So I put the proposal of A or B and the government went for both.
And I just said, these are the two things we're going to do. I think I went out next day and announced them. With effect from tomorrow, fuel excise will be reduced by 1.5 cents a litre. It's fair to say that the Treasurer was not happy with that.
Well, you know, I was looking at the bottom line. You know, I thought we could afford one or the other. I thought an immediate excise cut would give you more benefit. But, you know, this is the point. If you want to put before a government two alternatives, it's up to them. They can always say, I'll have both things. And they did.
Let me make it clear that I was plainly wrong in not understanding some of the concerns held by the Australian people about the price of petrol.
Oh, I think there was a cheer. There was a cheer that we weren't blindly going down some ideological path and ignoring political reality.
We needed to do something really decisive, and it worked. But it wasn't just that decision alone. We took a different approach to government after that time. We were more pragmatic. And when problems arose, we sought to fix them.
Pragmatism was now the catch cry of the government. Politically, it was back on track. But there was a bombshell to come. It would expose the fault lines between the Prime Minister and his Treasurer for all to see.
News came through from the Bulletin that they had a big story for the next day. And they faxed through, I think, the front cover and the story. And it was the Shane Stone memo.
The memo from Liberal Party President Shane Stone to John Howard had been written after the Queensland state election defeat.
Peter Costello was the target of many of the quotes from federal Liberal MPs that the Howard government was mean, out of touch, tricky and dysfunctional.
Oh, well, it just hit like a bomb out of the blue.
And it was scathing about the government.
It was critical of Peter, critical of the Prime Minister as well, but said the government had been mean and tricky.
When the story broke, the Treasurer was in Washington.
And my phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I thought, oh boy, you know, some disaster, I wonder what's going on.
I woke her and told her all about it, and she was, you know, she woke up pretty quickly when I told her the substance of it and told her the fax was already on the way to her room.
I read it. It was probably worse than I expected, although it was framed Dear John. It was really Blame Peter. So I got up and got showered and got dressed and got the fax and I slipped it under Peter's hotel room door.
Well, of course, I don't know anything about the memo. It wasn't written by me and it wasn't received by me, so I know nothing about it. Well, I just thought it was political incompetence, seasoned with a bit of political treachery. Why write it? That's incompetent. Why leak it? That's treachery.
Well, look, Peter was very unhappy about the Shane Stone memo. He made that very clear to me. I remember he was in America. I rang him about it. He was very upset about it, and I can understand why he was upset about it.
Well, I just said I could not believe that Shane Stone would write this in a memo. I said to him, you know, if he's got complaints about the government or me, why doesn't he come and talk to me? or in fact talk to you. Why would you write a memo?
I thought it was dreadful. I thought it was very unfair on the Treasurer. I did think, if I'm really honest about it, that there might have been a germ of truth in it in terms of the way we were seen publicly as a government.
Why should anyone who remembers...
Attention turned to how journalist Laurie Oakes got hold of the memo.
Look, if there was one copy and it was written by Shane and given to John, the leaks come from one of those two sources.
All I can say is that I didn't put it out, I didn't want it out, and I understand it did upset Peter, and I had no desire to hurt people. It wasn't in my interest to upset Peter Costello. I mean, it was in my interest and the interest of the government for us to work together.
I don't know who leaked it. I suspect I'll never know who leaked it, but I know one thing, they were a complete idiot.
Treasurer, has the hatchet been buried?
Have you received an apology from Mr Stone?
Thanks.
Are you considering a challenge?
The only thing that survived out of the whole Shane Stone memo were the words mean and tricky, and they didn't come back to haunt me so much as to haunt John Howard.
Paradoxically, perhaps, I think it was good for the government because it created a, perhaps it promoted more reflection upon, some of the style of government and the lack of responsiveness on issues.
It's incredible in another country. Good on you, Pat, you got advantage now.
If there was one lesson John Howard now understood, it was do not let issues drift. One issue that had been drifting was border protection.
It's the fifth boat to land at Christmas Island in recent months.
Between 1999 and mid-2001, around 8,000 asylum seekers had landed on Australian shores.
The government's alarm is because the numbers are accelerating.
As many as 10,000 people could be packing up now in the Middle East with a view to trying to access Australia.
It was an alarming prospect, with detention camps built by the previous Labor government already overflowing.
There was a sense growing in the community that this issue was getting out of control.
That we needed places to put these people, and that we had significant infrastructure problems. And it was then that the government collectively decided they had to do something about these queue jumpers.
If thousands of boat people were on the way, the government was determined they'd be turned around. John Howard believed there was only one organisation capable of doing that job.
Does anyone speak English?
The Defence Force.
We felt that the situation had got so hard and there were so many boats coming that we had to more heavily involve the Navy.
To send the boats back. And once the strategy was, once you'd done that, they would stop coming.
Behind closed doors, there was robust discussion about the Navy's role.
This is a classic Navy operation, but it's dirty work. Sailors don't like it.
I think there were varying degrees of enthusiasm, but the Navy is a disciplined service.
The Navy really had no choice but to do what the government wanted it to do. It's not there to interpret the moral grounds of government decisions.
With the Navy now on alert, the government's strategy was about to be tested. On August the 26th, 2001, the MV Tampa, a Norwegian container ship, rescued 430 asylum seekers from a sinking fishing boat.
Morning.
I remember the day very well when the Tampa issue got going.
The Prime Minister was resolute. These people would not be allowed to land on Australian soil.
Mr Speaker, the government has requested the Tampa not enter Australian territorial waters and that it should continue on its original route to Indonesia.
If the Tampa then proceeded to unload these immigrants in Australia, the government's policy, the message to the people smugglers would be that the Australian government had no intention of enforcing its policy. So then why not move from small fishing boats to large fishing trawlers?
One of the things I really remember is Maxmore Wilton talking to the agent of the Tampa about the ship's captain, and Max saying something like, well, you better tell that captain of yours if he comes in here, he might be coming in here permanently. So, you know, Max was very blunt.
And we indicated to the company if they insisted on seeking to come into an Australian port, they would in fact be stopped. They were left in no doubt about that.
The Tampa quickly became headline news. Debate raged. Some lawyers argued the government had broken maritime convention by refusing to allow the Tampa to dock at Christmas Island.
We haven't violated that international seafaring tradition. This ship was en route to Indonesia after the people had been picked up. And as a result of the duress, the captain had to abandon that plan, and we now have this impasse. And I don't think in all of this debate that sequence of events should be lost sight of.
The Norwegian government was not amused.
According to international law, the captain is in his full right to enter into Australian territorial water because he has declared his ship in distress.
The Norwegian Foreign Minister took the matter up with his Australian counterpart in the middle of the night.
And I said to him, well, look, it's kind of early in the morning, Minister, and I'm surprised you'd ring me at 2 in the morning. I've really just been fast asleep, but I don't have to be very wide awake to tell you that we're not going to allow them to land in Australia. The Tampa can take these people to Indonesia. And so he said, well, it doesn't really matter in the end what you think. The ship is going to land them in Australia. And I said, well, Minister, that is a bold thing to say and quite an aggressive thing to say. But I think I can give you an assurance that we won't allow them to land. And I think we can make sure that happens.
Then we felt the only thing that we could do in order to stop it defying our request was, in fact, to use the military.
As Defence Minister, probably the only sort of specific order I ever gave, I said, CDF, I'm giving you a very clear instruction to proceed with the operation to put your blokes onto the Tampa. So, no, it was an action-charged moment.
Three days after the Tampa came into view, the SAS boarded the ship and took control.
The SAS was a disproportionate response.
I knew it was going to be controversial. I knew I would be criticised, but I knew it was the right thing to do.
If John Howard believed this was the right thing to do, the government was also keeping a close eye on public reaction. As the crisis developed, it became clear this issue had real implications for the government's popularity and for the way people might vote in the next election.
People think the border protection issue was all about some massive wedge politics that John Howard wanted to play. But I can tell you that's not right.
Despite the popular myth, John Howard didn't poll the decision on Tampa. He just went and did it. But it became immediately clear that people completely supported his position.
We posed the question, should Australia turn away the boat people? 90% of calls, that's more than 110,000 callers, agreed that this group should be turned away.
With the SAS now in control of the Tampa, the burning question was what to do with the people on board. If they set foot on Australian soil, they could claim refugee status. And John Howard was adamant that would not happen.
The PM did want an early solution in terms of where people would go, so we don't by default get left with the only option being us taking them. So it was an issue of where else they could be sent to.
John Howard said to me, well, go and find someone who'll take them. So I went back up to my office and got my staff together there and said, well, now we are literally going to have to think up a country to send these people to that'll take them. one of my staff, she said, well, look, you had that call from Rene Harris, the president of Nauru, a week or so ago, pleading for $200,000 or $300,000 so he could pay for some oil. So what about ringing him? That was a good idea, I thought, so I rang Rene Harris. And he said, you know, that would be fine.
So I was the one delegated, actually, to go off to Nauru and did the negotiations with him.
A deal was signed. The Prime Minister's wish had been granted. The refugees would not come to Australia.
When I told him I'd implemented, he said I'd done an outstanding job yet again as the Foreign Minister. I tell you this, he was seriously pleased with me for fixing up this problem. So that's the birth of the Pacific solution. It's as simple as that.
The Pacific solution, though, came at a price. In all, it cost the taxpayer over $1 billion. And in time, the government's tough stance against asylum seekers would lead to tensions within the coalition.
In 2001, a situation had been created in which there was a concern about a crisis. That crisis was not a genuine crisis. People did not have an appreciation of how few asylum seekers were involved. They thought that we were being swamped.
We refuse to leave the ship. We want to go to Australia.
I thought that this was partly policy on the run. And the more you looked at it, the more uncomfortable you became. And the way it was being used for straight political reasons.
And the Pacific solution, whatever people may sarcastically say about it, it worked. I mean, in July and August of 2001, the sense was that boats were arriving willy-nilly. By the early part of November, they had stopped. And that was because of the measures we took.
On the 8th of September 2001, John Howard flew to Washington for his first meeting with President George W. Bush.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here.
Border protection was at the forefront of his mind. He could reflect that his strong stance on national security had helped turn his party's fortunes around. But what he didn't know was that in a few days' time, national security would be the only game in town.